Welcome students. Welcome to our special discussion on society and culture. This is a part of a discussion on the course of PSS, Preparatory Course in Social Sciences. Well, I'm Arvashum. I'm from the Faculty of Sociology, School of Social Sciences, IGNU. And we have an expert here with me on my right side, Dr. Nita Mathur. She is also from the Faculty of Sociology, School of Social Sciences, IGNU. Well, before we go into the details, I would just like to orient you about how we would like to go about. Well, when we talk about society and culture, we thought that some of these points will be relevant to you so that you know something about society and culture and the relationships and the various components, aspects that relate to society and culture. So, first of all, we'll be telling you something about the interrelationship between the two. Then we'll define what is society and culture, and then we'll have to discuss more into details about society and culture, the various aspects and the processes and everything that is part of society and culture. And when we discuss society, we'll be touching some of the points on social forms. When we speak of social forms, then we know that there is social structure, then there is culture, there is statuses, there are roles. And beneath that also there are so many, because we find that the structure is not the structure alone. Culture, for example, encompasses so many. So there are so many aspects which we would like to throw upon in the course of a discussion, such as social stratification, social mobility, pluralism, social change, and thereon we can take on to some concepts and aspects like modernization, secularization, then rural-urban divide or division. Then we'll, in contextual analysis, we'll try to bring to you some aspects on the Indian context and some other contexts also. And when we talk about Indian context, we'd like to discuss basically on castes as an aspect of society and culture, and class also. Then we'll also try to touch upon tribal situation as a context. So I think we have got a lot of aspects to be discussed today, and we'll make sure that we touch most of these points. Well, to begin with, before we define society and culture in some more details, I would like to throw some analysis on this relationship or interrelationship between society and culture. Why should we give the name society and culture, for example? What is the relationship that we should be talking about? Of course, we'll be talking in details of society and culture. In the first place, society and culture are just like two sides of the same coin. Two sides of the same coin in the sense that analytically they can be separated, but in actual existential level it will be not possible to actually separate them, because they are, for example, society creates culture, or in other words, culture is created by society. And on the other hand, culture survives society. Culture is an instrument to enhance the adaptive ability of society to survive and to perpetuate, to continue societal life. So in this sense, they are both interdependent in some way. Like I said, they are two sides of the same coin. Like what Herskovits rightly said, culture is like a screen between man and nature, or man and environment. He uses nature. He means that man exploits nature or environment, your surrounding, whatever, and man also creates or shapes the environment. So in that sense, he says, culture is like a screen between man and nature. Well, without going into the detail of the relationship, I think we can start with this as the relationship between society and culture. And now we'd like to share something about the concept of society and culture and some other aspects. I would request Dr. Nita to start with these concepts of society and culture and some related aspects.
Okay. Thank you, Ashim. Well, he has already told you that the interrelationship between society and culture is intricate, intimate, inseparable. Right? Now, a natural question that comes to the mind is, after all, what is this whole business, or what is this concept of society that is being talked about? What is this concept of culture that is being talked about? We've talked about the interrelationship and said they are inseparable, intimate, very closely linked. But then, what are they? Well, let's start with the concept of society, and I'll begin with an analogy. Now, just think of a house, right? A house has many rooms. It may have 2 rooms, it may have 3 rooms. It has very defined, in essence what we are trying to say is, it has very defined spaces for doing different kinds of work. Now, there is a separate space for cooking, we call it the kitchen. There is a separate space or separate room for sleeping, we call it the bedroom. There's a separate room for taking a bath, we call it the bathroom, right? So what is a house? A house is an aggregate of all these rooms. Each room is connected with the other room through how? Through doors, through windows, through ventilators. That is how one room is connected with the other room and with the other spaces in the house. Now, just think, if we were to close in a room, close the doors, close the windows, close the ventilator or ventilators, what happens? The room becomes an entity unto itself, yet it continues to be a part of the house. Okay? Now, moving on from here, think of a village. A village consists of an aggregate of houses. Each house is dependent in some form, in some way or the other, with the other house, yet it stands as an independent entity unto itself. Agreed? Now, from this analogy, what are the 2 or 3 points that emerge? The one point that emerges very, very clearly is the aspect of interconnectedness. Right? We just talked of interconnections between the rooms. We talked of interconnections between and among different houses in a village. So we talked of the interconnectedness. The other aspect that assumes or that becomes very important or that comes out very clearly from this analogy is boundary maintenance. What do we mean by boundary maintenance? Each room has its own boundary, has its own 4 walls. Each house has its own boundary. Each village has its own boundary, right? And the third point that comes out is aggregation or collection. So we said a collection of rooms organized in a particular way constitutes the house. A collection of houses organized in a particular way, set in a particular way, constitutes a village. So the aspect of aggregation becomes important. And then the fourth aspect that becomes important is the vantage point of the observer. how are we viewing the structure? Are we treating a room as an entity, or are we treating the house as an entity, or are we treating the village as an entity? Now, a society exhibits all these four characteristics. The characteristics of interconnectedness, boundary maintenance, aggregation, and the vantage point of the observer. Now, this analogy of comparing the structure, the house with, or the structure of a building with society, was given several years ago by Herbert Spencer himself. Right? But there is a difference. There is a difference between a house and society. Remember, this is an analogy. When we say analogy, if we say there is an analogous relationship, or there is an analogy between A and B, we say A is like B. That is an analogy. But we don't say that A is B. That becomes homology. Right? So we are talking of analogy. We say this is like this. A society is like a house. This is what we mean. And I'll also tell you the difference between society and the house. The difference is that the house is physically, tangibly present. You can see it. It exists before your eyes. You can go and touch it. Society is not like that. What is a society after all? It's a construct. House is physically touchable. You can identify, you can point out, you can touch it. You can even deconstruct it physically. Society is not like that. But this is the analogy that Herbert Spencer gave in order to explain what society is. There's another analogy which makes the whole concept of society very clear, and it's called the organic analogy. This forms the foundation of several theories that came later in the field of sociology and social sciences in general. Now, what is an organic analogy? Organic analogy supposes that society is like an organism. Society is like an organism? How? Society is like an organism because you consider an organism. Now, any organism is made up of what? Cells. Cells aggregate, come together, combine to form tissues. Tissues combine to form organs. Organs combine to form the organism. If you go backwards, then you would say you can split the organism into its organs, organs into tissues, tissues into cells. Right? Now, think of a society. A society starts with an individual, a socialized individual. Individuals come together to form groups. Groups form communities. Communities form society. And one can proceed backwards and arrive at the starting point of the socialized individual. And I will tell you later who a socialized individual is, what is socialization. We will talk about that later. But this analogy is a very common analogy that is used to explain the concept of society. Again, there is a difference. A cell can exist independently, right? An individual cannot. And Aristotle said that only two kinds of individuals can stay isolated, in isolation. What are the two kinds? Either the individual is not mentally all right. He is a madman or a mad person. Or that individual is God himself or herself. Other than these two categories, human beings cannot stay in isolation. The basic number in which a human being can exist is a dyad. At least two people must be present for an individual to survive. Now, again, In this analogy also, what is important is the interconnection between parts, the aggregation. We said cells aggregate to form tissues, tissues aggregate to form organs, organs aggregate to form the organism. Now, if we have understood this much, then we can go on to the dictionary meaning of sociology, of society. I said sociology because what is sociology? It is the study of society and all that happens in society. So unless we understand this whole concept of society, sociology is difficult to understand. Okay? Now, the dictionary meaning of sociology is that the dictionary meaning of society is that it is a human community which has three characteristics. One is fixed territorial location, right? So it is present in a defined territory, in a demarcated territory. The second is that it has a shared common culture and common activities. And I'll tell you what culture is, don't worry. The third is that it has cultural and institutional interdependence between the members. And there is a fourth characteristic, that it is differentiated from other communities and groups. This is how the dictionary employs the term sociology, or this is the dictionary meaning of sociology, which is very, very pervasive, which includes and which is self-sufficient, right? Now, when we understand this, then let's go on to how many kinds of societies can there be. Well, Tönnies talked of at least two kinds of societies. He talked of the Gemeinschaft society and the Gesellschaft society. These are German words. Gemeinschaft is an ideal type or model society in which the interrelationships among individuals are personal. There are a lot of shared values, a lot of shared emotions, a lot of shared beliefs. Now, let's think of an example. One can think of a village in the traditional sense, where everybody knew everybody else in the village. Or let's think of a mohalla. Now, a mohalla has its own names, it has different gullies, houses are organized in the gullies. What's more important than everything else, apart from this structure of the mohalla, and let's not get into that, is the interrelationship among individuals in the mohalla. Each person knows the other person. Each person's identity merges or is a part of the larger identity of the mohalla, right? Each mohalla, in the traditional sense, had a character. Now, there could be a mohalla in which was considered as one in which people are very aggressive, right? So, when there were grooms who would take brides, and if they wanted a bride from that particular mohalla, someone or the other would turn around and say, "Oh, a bride from that mohalla? But you know, that's a mohalla in which everybody is very aggressive. The bride, if you take from there, is going to be aggressive." Right? That is what I mean when I say that each mohalla had an identity of its own. It's an example of a Gemeinschaft kind of a society. Also applies to a large extent to village societies, not the modern day villages which are which are nearing the cities, or which are more like towns, which are more like cities also, but in the traditional sense, where people knew each other, people participated in each other's joys, sorrows, everything, successes and failures, and where they held common identity, they shared beliefs, they shared very strong emotions, and there was a lot of interdependence among them. Now, the other word that I used in contrast to Gemeinschaft, about which I have just explained, is the term Gesellschaft. Both these words, I said earlier, were put forward by Tönnies. Now, what is a Gesellschaft kind of a society? Now, Gesellschaft kind of a society is one in which the bonds are impersonal, formal, narrow, strict, and there is lot of specialization. There is a lot of distinction between private sphere of life and public sphere of life. What is the example that comes to mind at this stage? Immediately is the example of city life, where there is each person has an identity of his own or her own. There is a personal life, there is a private life, there are, very formal bonds. Think of an office, think of a bureaucratic setup, right? So that is what we mean when we say a Gesellschaft kind of a social arrangement. Now, when we talk of society, I will also explain to you two other words, and then go on to explaining what social structure is, what institutions is, how societies are maintained and perpetuated. That's another thing. But along with society, the other term that we have been, both Vashum and I have been using, is the term culture, and he explained to you what a culture is in a very broad sense. And if I give you Tyler's definition of culture, which is most frequently used in both sociology and anthropology, is culture or civilization is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other habit acquired by man as member of society. Now, the shared beliefs, the shared values that come or that play an important role in social relationships constitute culture. So, myths form part of culture, beliefs form part of culture, rituals form part of culture, right? Art form a part of culture. Traditional wisdom forms a part of culture. So, then, what is the distinction between society and culture? Is there a distinction between society and culture? Well, there are people who say there is no distinction between society and culture, but there are others who say that there is a distinction between society and culture. The distinction is that culture governs, to a large extent, the behavior of people in society. Now, in Tyler's definition of culture that I just mentioned to you, there was another term that was used, if any of you noticed. The term was civilization. But what is civilization? We know, we talked of culture, we talked of society. What is this called? What is this concept of civilization? We know, though, that we have read about, say, the Egyptian civilization, the Maya civilization. But what is civilization? In most simple terms, civilization refers to societies that exhibit complex culture and social organization. Complex culture and complex social organization. Now, several of you may ask me, what are the indicators of complexity? How do I know that this is complex culture and this is complex social organization? There should be some indicators. There are indicators. Basically, complex cultures and complex social organizations are characterized by cities, or they are the characteristics of cities. There is occupational specialization, there is intensive agricultural production, there is social stratification, there is long distance trade and commerce, there is monumental public architecture, and there is the presence of writing and other intellectual skills. Now, the term civilization is not used very frequently because it has been used in a very negative sense also in the earlier days. How? Civilization in earlier times, even some of us do it now, we equate civilization with civilized. Civilized with refinement. So, there are then two categories of people. People who are civilized, people who are not civilized or uncivilized. Now, is that true? Do we have a category of people who are uncivilized vis-a-vis a category of people who are civilized? Or do we say that people have different cultures and each culture is operative and is significant and is civilized in its own right, in its own form? How can we say one culture is better, so more civilized than another culture? This was a debate that lasted in sociology and social anthropology for a long time. The earlier anthropologists especially would say that certain cultures are uncivilized. Certain groups of people, certain societies are absolutely uncivilized. And then there was a lot of hue and cry, and there was this, by the way, this particular way of thinking is called ethnocentric perspective. Ethnocentric perspective means when you try to judge other people from your own vantage point, from your own, by your own standards. So by your own standards, if certain things don't, if you don't like certain things, you can call them bad or uncivilized. Certain things about a culture you don't like. If you don't like people shooting with bows and arrows, you say they are uncivilized. If they shoot with pistols, it's civilized. Why? Because that is a judgment that you make from your own standard. So that's the ethnocentric perspective. In contrast to the ethnocentric perspective is the whole concept of cultural relativism, which says that each culture should be judged by its own standards. So it's not appropriate to classify cultures into categories of, say, the civilized and the uncivilized, or the proper and the improper, or whatever like that. Now, when we have said this and we have clarified the concepts of society, culture, civilization, there's another concept that comes to mind when we study society, and that is and we began with something called structure. We have been talking about society. So then there is a concept of social structure. What is social structure? First of all, what is structure after all? Then we'll talk about what social structure is. Well, structure is an arrangement of parts. The way the parts in a particular system are organized constitutes its structure. Right? Now, if this is true, then what is social structure? And can social structure be observed? Can social structure be observed like other things, like other social phenomena? There is a debate on this, and I will tell you in a moment what the debate is. Well, sociologists have used the term structure, particularly social structure, to emphasize the interconnectedness or the interconnections between different parts. Right? The tricky question here is, what is the unit of analysis? Or what is it that we consider a part? Is part an individual? Is part a group? Is part institution? What is this part that we are talking about? And we are saying that social structure emphasizes the interconnectedness of parts. But what is a part in social structure? Well, for Radcliffe Brown, a part, social structure is an observable reality. He said, its sociology is like natural science. So like natural science has observable phenomena on which it is based, sociology also has observable phenomena on which it is based. And social structure is observable. Now, if social structures are real and observable, then what is the basic unit of analysis? Then the basic unit of analysis, Radcliffe Brown says, is the person. Person or individual? He draws a distinction between an individual and a person. He says an individual is a biological organism. A person is someone who is socialized, who is related with other aspects of society, who is a part of a wider group. That is how one can distinguish an individual and a person. That is the distinction that he draws. Now, after we have understood this much, we go on to a contradictory viewpoint that says social structure is not observable because it is the abstraction that you make out of the social relationships or what goes on in society that constitutes social structure. This is what Edmund Leach said. And I'll rush through and name another anthropologist because he also contributed a great deal to the understanding of social structure, and that is Levi-Strauss, who said that one observes the social relationships and sees the rules that govern them, and the set of rules constitutes social structure. So social structure is not an observable category like Radcliffe Brown said. Now these are different theories of social structure, different viewpoints, let's say, on social structure by eminent sociologists and anthropologists. Now, in order that a society sustains itself, a society has to perpetuate itself. Edmund Leach had said that the basic unit of society is not an individual or a person that Radcliffe Brown had said, but social group. And it is the interconnectedness between social groups that constitute social structure. But then, how do social groups and individuals contribute to the maintenance of society? Well, this happens through the process of socialization or enculturation. And at this stage, I think Dr. Vasham would want to contribute.
Well, you have done a great deal on the concept of society and the culture and various aspects and the social forms, where you have started with social structure. Well, just to recap the social structure part, I think I would like to also communicate to the students also about social structure, just in a few lines. Well, sociologists understand social structure as, something abstract which cannot be seen, but there are regularities. They can be seen also according to some sociologists, of course. So that Dr. Nidita had categorically said. But what sociologists, also scientists, are most interested, and the basis for construction of that structure is the regularities of interactions. For example, in a hostel, for example, in a boarding, people go to meal, go to study room, they go to play together, they interact and whatsoever. But then, when they stay together, live together, sleep together, there are some patterns, some regularities that can be seen. For example, there might be a leader or maybe a monitor among the students also. And even the patterns of everyday life, which are always, shown in some way, in some pattern. So those regularities are the basis for constructing of that structure. And a teacher-student relationship, for example, if we have to draw a pyramid or something, then we find that a teacher, for example, would not go to the student's room always, for example, if the student has a room. But rather, the student might go to the teacher or the head of department or whatsoever because of certain channel. And that is certain structure that the relationship is built upon, and which can be seen, or sometimes people construct it, but these are some regularities. So that is social structure that we are talking about. And of course, other social forms are, statuses, then there are roles, then there are, of course, socialization and culturation. Yeah, socialization, in order that one knows about life, about society, one has to learn something in some way or the other, maybe from the parents, maybe from teachers, maybe from friends, peer group, or whatsoever. In one way or the other, one learns something through interactions, through observation. And so one's life is also molded and shaped by such process. And that process goes on and on in one's life. And that kind of process is called by social scientists sociologists as socialization. And also one term which Dr. Nida had mentioned, enculturation, is a coinage of Herskovits, if I'm not mistaken. So he wanted to mean almost the same thing, but he emphasizes more on imbibing of culture and being a part of the culture. One learns the culture of the society. And so he also thinks almost in terms of socialization, but socialization is a longer process in a way. But now, in a society, if we have a structure, there is also statuses also. And we can talk almost, linking with social stratification again. But now we'll just stick on to social status first. Now, these social statuses are certain positions one holds or one has, people recognize in that specific context or in that society, maybe in a family, because family sociologists take it as one of the finest and smallest unit for analysis of a society. So a father will have, usually in a patrilineal society, has the status of, maybe godfather or maybe the head of the family. The wife, of course, maybe second head, should we say, or who takes care of the domestic affairs, the family affairs, rather than external affairs. In terms of monetary affairs, maybe father may be doing more, or not these days, of course. And certain statuses, children cannot be considered as father because they are not father. So there are certain ways of recognizing people, having people their own positions. So this is a kind of status. Children has a status, then mother has a status of her own with her roles, and the father also has a status. And in many societies, in a larger context, maybe in a village, for example, the king or the chief, maybe the head of the village. Then there are also some, in that structure, there are also maybe the village councils, they have a status, statutory body again, and under which there might be clans, various clans, the heads or maybe the heads of each clan, they have certain status again. And so there are so many ways. And in some society, there is yet another way of positioning people, persons, personalities. For example, someone who is a great warrior, for example, he is recognized as someone, patriot or a great man, and he's regarded by the villages. He has that status. And some rich people are also considered as someone, who can also influence, who can have, power and authority in some way. And he has certain status, for example. And, the common people may have that lower statuses. And this also speaks of the roles and expectations of these personalities of individuals. So this is, in short, statuses and roles. Now, this is also part of, we are talking of social stratification, because social stratification in a society, there are different layers of, existence. Like I said, if there are statuses, then there are layers. So there are stratas in a society, and we can give as context, in the Indian context, we can speak of caste system, for example, and we can speak of class system, for example. And when we speak of social stratification, we can speak of social differentiation also. Like, for example, social differentiation in many societies, in many pre-literate society or simple societies, is mainly based on age and sex, for example. Like what I said, age groups, elderly people, then younger ones, and younger ones still. There are different age groups. So, and there is also a difference between man and woman, and which is called sex, when we speak in terms of social differentiation. So all this comes under social stratification. Well, I'm afraid I think we are almost running out of time. We thought we will complete many aspects which are yet to be delivered. But I think maybe in 1 minute or so, would you like to say something on the caste system?
Yeah, and
because we have only
you talked of the caste
more.
system in the context of social stratification, and the caste system does indeed provide a very good example of how society gets stratified, because the Brahmins are placed at the top, the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas and the Shudras. Now, within the caste system, there is very little scope for mobility to take place. One is, he talked of status, and there are two kinds of statuses. One is the achieved status that one acquires in the course of one's life. Then there is the ascribed status into which one person is born. So the status that one acquires at the time of birth in the context of caste system is given. Mobility is really not possible. But social mobility is possible in a class system. And there are two kinds of mobility. There is the intergenerational mobility, in which mobility takes place across generation. And I'll give you an example. For example, if there is a cobbler's son who becomes a doctor in a hospital, that is intergenerational mobility. From one generation to another, there is a difference in status. Intragenerational mobility is mobility within the generation, within the same generation. A person who is a school teacher becomes the principal of a college or something like that. It is within the same generation. So we talked of social mobility, which is a characteristic of which very frequently happens in societies.
Well, Dr. Nida, I'm afraid I think we are running out of time, and I thank you so much for having contributed a lot in this deliberation. And I hope students have learned something from our deliberation, and we encourage you to ask questions if you have, but since you have not asked, maybe you can ask through electronic communications, through telephone or through email or whatever. We'll be happy to respond to your queries, and we enjoy delivering our discussion here, and I hope you have enjoyed too. And this is all for today. Thank you.